learners, and welcome to another mini lesson. In this video, we're going to cover the anatomy and function of the brain and cranial nerves. The brain is divided into three portions: the cerebrum, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain and consists of two halves or hemispheres. The hemispheres are connected by a bridge of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. The surface of the cerebrum is covered with folds and grooves. The ridges or bumps are called gyri. The singular of the word is gyrus, and the grooves are called sulci, and the singular of the word is sulcus. The whole cerebrum is divided into four lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The frontal lobe is located behind the forehead and is responsible for memory, intellect, concentration, problem solving, and emotion, and some voluntary motor control. The parietal lobe is located high on each side of the brain behind the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is mostly responsible for interpreting sensory information like pain, pressure, touch, temperature, and proprioception. Proprioception means the awareness of where your body parts are located in space. The temporal lobe is located below the parietal lobe and frontal lobes and is involved in interpreting and processing auditory information or sounds, producing speech, and housing our memory centers. The occipital lobe is located at the back of the brain and the most inferior part of the brain, and is the most inferior portion of the brain. This lobe is responsible for interpreting and processing visual information, depth perception, facial recognition, processing movement, and some memory. It's important to understand that many functions of the brain are redundant so that not one area is solely responsible for one thing. There's a lot of overlap between functions and lobes. Okay, so moving down to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a smaller portion of the brain that lies inferior or below the cerebrum. The cerebellum coordinates skeletal muscle activity and helps maintain posture and balance. The brainstem is an elongated portion of the brain that lies inferior to the cerebrum and anterior to the cerebellum. The brainstem is responsible for vital functions like regulating breathing and heart rate and relaying information to the higher centers of the brain. The brainstem basically connects the brain and the spinal cord. And finally, within each hemisphere of the brain are spaces called ventricles. These ventricles contain the watery cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. The CSF circulates through the ventricles and around the brain and spinal cord continuously. The function of the CSF is to protect, cushion, and nourish the central nervous system. Okay, let's talk about the functional regions of the brain. The thalamus receives sensory stimuli and channels them to the correct lobe for processing. At this point, the fibers in the brain decussate or cross over. So impulses received from the right side of the body go to the left side of the brain, and impulses from the left side of the body go to the right side of the brain. The hypothalamus is sometimes called the thermostat of the body. Its job is to regulate a lot of the body functions. So it regulates things like blood pressure, body temperature, water, and electrolyte balance. Hunger, body weight, sleep, wakefulness, and the digestive tract are all regulated within the hypothalamus. The basal nuclei control voluntary muscular movements and posture, emotion, cognition, things like that. The limbic system controls emotional experience, fear, anger, pleasure, and sadness. The brainstem we mentioned earlier. It contains two main areas, the pons and the medulla oblongata. The pons serves as a relay station for sensory impulses to higher brain regions. The medulla oblongata contains vital control areas like the cardiac center, the respiratory center, the vasomotor center, and the reticular formation, which stimulates the cerebral cortex into wakefulness. So this area of the brain is our most basic control center, and it controls our most vital functions. The cerebellum, we mentioned earlier, looks like a little mini brain, and it coordinates skeletal muscle activity to maintain our posture and balance. Now let's look at the cranial nerves. If we look at the underside or inferior aspect of the brain, we can see 12 pairs of cranial nerves exiting the brain. These cranial nerves, along with the spinal cord, allow the brain to communicate with the rest of the body. The cranial nerves are given a name and a Roman numeral, and they can contain either sensory, motor, or a combination of fibers. We won't spend too much time learning each individual nerve, but some of the important ones include cranial nerve number 1, which is the olfactory nerve, and that controls your sense of smell. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve, which provides sensory information for vision. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve, and that controls movement of the eyes and the size of the pupils. And cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve, and this is a mixed nerve, so it contains sensory and motor fibers, and it's part of the parasympathetic system. And that supplies organs of speech, the diaphragm, and a bunch of internal organs in the thorax and the abdomen. There are many different ways to remember the names of the cranial nerves. Here is a mnemonic from your book. There's a lot more you can find online and even visual ones to help you remember the function of each of the nerves. And here's a list of all the nerves and their names. The spinal cord is an extension of the brainstem and also part of the central nervous system. It is a major link between the brain and the peripheral nervous system and a pathway for both the sensory and motor impulses. The spinal cord extends from the base of the brain through the spinal canal and down to the first lumbar vertebrae. After that, a group of nerve fibers called the cauda equina extends down through the remaining portion of the vertebral canal. The spinal cord is divided into 4 regions, the same way the vertebrae are divided into regions. Spinal nerves arise from each side of the spinal cord. The cervical region is continuous with the medulla oblongata and has 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. This region is abbreviated C1 through C8. The next region is the thoracic region. It has 12 pairs of spinal nerves that supply the chest and back region, and it is abbreviated T1 through T12. The lumbar region is below the thoracic region, and it supplies the hips and anterior lower limbs, and has 5 pairs of spinal nerves. It's abbreviated L1 to L5. The sacral region is the last region and supplies the posterior legs, buttocks, and genitalia. It has 5 spinal nerves and is abbreviated S1 to S5. If you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, you would see what looks like a gray butterfly shape in the middle surrounded by white edges with a small hole in the center. The hole is the central canal and contains CSF. The white matter contains myelinated axons that are organized into tracts, and these tracts are basically bundles of nerve fibers that have a common origin and destination. Think of the spinal cord like an elevator. The sensory impulses ride the spinal cord elevator up to the brain. The motor impulses ride the spinal cord elevator down from the brain, down the spinal cord, and out the spinal nerves to where they need to go. Each spinal nerve, except C1, innervates a specific area of the skin called a dermatome. And each spinal nerve, except C1, exits and enters the spinal cord through an intervertebral space. C1 exits above the vertebrae under the skull. The brain and spinal cord are protected within the skull and vertebral column by 3 layers of connective tissue called meninges. The outermost layer of the meninges is called the dura mater, which is Latin for tough mother or hard mother. The next layer is the arachnoid mater, which is a thin web-like membrane. Below that is the pia mater, which means soft mother or delicate mother. And this is a thin layer that adheres directly to the brain or spinal cord and supplies the nerves and blood vessels which nourish the brain and the spinal cord. The area between the dura mater and the walls of the vertebrae or skull is referred to as the epidural space. Remember, epi means above or upon, so epidural means above the dura. The subdural space is the space below the dura mater. And similarly, the subarachnoid space would be the space below the arachnoid layer, so between the arachnoid layer and the pia mater. And that's it. That's all for this video. Next time we will cover some disorders of the nervous system. As always, I thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time. Thanks.